Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, PBM, Customers Bank, Collins Building Services, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Marks Paneth, Capital One Bank. Additional funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from Amerant Bank, Bank of America, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Kesmatidis, Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Ocean First Bank, People's United Bank, RPW Group, TD Bank, and these friends. Riverdale, New York, Great Neck, Long Island, University of Southern California, Wharton, manufactures Hanover Bank, E.F. Hutton, real estate. I don't know anything about real estate, but I'm going to get involved with real estate. I'm going to get involved with all different aspects of real estate. Today, I have the founder, president, and chairman of Wharton Equity Partners, Peter Lewis. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Michael. So happy to be here.
So as I alluded with Riverdale, why don't we start talking about your father's family and then your mother's family? Tell me about your dad's family.
They're Russian and English immigrants. My dad was actually second generation. Interesting story. I think I mentioned to you, my dad was one of the pioneers in the toy business, in licensing. And he was involved in bringing all of us Gumby. I often joke that Gumby paid for my undergraduate and Pokey paid for my graduate degree. I grew up in a childhood where I always had toys around me. I was a very popular kid. I wasn't certain if it was me that they liked or the fact that I had all these toys.
But he wasn't in that business originally. Let's talk about that because it's also interesting how he met your mother and that she sang at Carnegie Hall.
That's right. So my mom's side of the family, Sephardi Jews from Europe. My grandfather was a cantor and a bartender, and they were first generation coming over from Turkey and Spain. And my mom was an opera singer, but a real opera singer with a lot of talent. And as you just mentioned, she grew up, she went to music and art. She went to perform at Carnegie Hall, she performed on the radio. And I grew up around music. I was a piano player, but I was an athlete as a child. And I often got pulled from my basketball practices with the permission of the coach to go home and take piano lessons. I was always ridiculed by my friends about that. But so my mom, at an early age, lost her husband in a boating accident, a freak accident off the Montauk Point. And she was with a baby of 8 months old, my brother. And who arrives at the front door when my mom calls for a photographer to remember those times, but my father. And they fell in love. And although my father's parents were against it because he was inheriting a child, love won the day. And they were married for 60 years, I believe, close to it. My mom passed away fairly recently. My dad's still alive at 93. And so they wound up moving to Riverdale. This all occurred in the Bronx, by the way.
Now, when they moved to Riverdale, what was your dad doing at that time? He wasn't in the toy business?
Selling photography. So he would go in, he'd be the one opening the door for the company, and then ultimately the photographer came to baby pictures. So my father was a baby picture salesman.
Many of the people used to get it from Sears. I think Sears
was the competitor.
Was the big baby picture company. And one of the baby pictures, he was able to sell himself and the baby pictures to your mom.
That's right.
So let's talk about You were born in Riverdale.
I was born in Riverdale. I was a few years old when my parents decided to move out to Great Neck, Long Island. I believe at that time primarily for the schools. And we settled into an area called Saddle Rock Estates, which was somewhat walking distance to Saddle Rock, which was the elementary school. And I grew up in an idyllic childhood. We had a little pool in the neighborhood that was a community pool. I was best friends with all my neighbors. We used to ride out at night in their pajamas, play kickball. You know, it was just an amazing childhood. And we subsequently moved to the little better part of town in an area called Strathmore, which is next to the high school and next to the temples as well. We used to sneak out of the high school on occasion and go underneath the fence and run down to my house, and I'd play basketball with my friends and watch Get Smart. And my mom acquiesced and let us do it. Also, interestingly, I don't think I mentioned this to you, but because we lived near the temple, we weren't a very religious family, but we observed. But on occasion, I was a big basketball player, as I may have mentioned. On Saturdays, the families walking to Temple Israel, which had to go down our street, I was out there shooting baskets and I got some nasty looks. You know, I shouldn't be playing basketball on Saturday.
You were very active in a lot of sports, okay?
Basketball, baseball, and soccer. So I was a three-team player. I happened to be fortunate. I was the captain on all of them. Really obsessed with sports as a child. And I was also, which went in tow with this, was going to camps that were specialized in sports. Ultimately going to a camp called Camp Lenox in Lee, Massachusetts, where I was taught by the coach of Columbia at that time, a guy named Jack Rowan, who was a really well-known coach and one of the great experiences of my life, not only just for basketball, but also life lessons. Very interesting guy.
How did your dad get involved with Gumby, the two characters over there? Did he create them or? So
this is really fascinating, actually. So my dad migrated over to becoming a toy salesman from being a photography salesman through some neighbors I think he knew up in Riverdale. And he worked for a company called Shopper. And then somewhere along the line, he started thinking about the idea of licensing toys. No one had done it before him. He was really the pioneer in licensing. So during that era, you'll remember this, there was companies called The Rookies, Emergency. These are all Universal Studios concoctions. And my dad approached Universal to license their, the name, and it put it on walkie-talkies and things like that. Also at the same time, during that era, Gumby was a really big TV thing in the morning, on Saturday mornings. Gumby, Pokey, it was a claymation program. And my dad saw the allure of that program, and he actually went into the mountains of Malibu to track down this guy, Art Clokey, who lived in this little house with Gumbies all over the place. And he asked him if he could license Gumby, which he wound up doing with some other folks. And they brought the Bendable to the world.
So how did your parents move out to California?
So after growing up in Great Neck, my father, when he was a young guy at 16 years old, he went across country with his best friend. And when he got to the West Coast, he vowed to himself that someday he would come back and live there, a boy from the Bronx. And when the opportunity came, he wound up selling his business to Universal because he had become a major licensee, and they ultimately, I guess, it was cheaper for them to buy him. And he moved, and he made a decision with my mom, who went along with it, to move out to California. And they wound up going out to Beverly Hills, and they bought one of Elizabeth Taylor's houses.
Now, where were you at this time when they moved out to the hill?
So I just graduated high school, and I wound up going out to California, and I followed them out there and actually gave it a shot and I got into USC. So I wound up going to USC for about a year and a half, and I just was out of place. I didn't like the school. I didn't like the environment. It's too sunny out there. I didn't like LA. I decided to apply back east to Ivy League schools. And I was fortunate enough to get into Wharton, where I transferred. And my parents were actually 100% behind that. They were excited. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting story here. During the time I applied and the time I got in, I met a great young lady who was adorable. And when I got into Wharton, I told my parents, you know what, I had a change of heart. I'm going to wind up staying back out in LA. And my father said, there's no way. So I give my parents credit, because it would have been easier for them to say, oh, look at this, our son's staying close by. But they had the foresight to realize what Wharton meant. And I went back east.
So let's talk about Wharton. Wharton was a great place, but you had no idea that you were going to get involved with real estate. You were more involved with finance and accounting.
Right. Exactly. My parents still laugh to this day that I'm even in the real estate business because I didn't know what a hammer was. I mean, I used to, if I had something like that to do in the family, I'd give it to my younger brother, who was very inclined to that. My older brother builds cars, so both of them, I got off the hook on anything to do that was related to building anything. So it was a little joke that I wound up in real estate. But when I graduated business school, undergraduate at Wharton, I actually went back out to the West Coast to give it another shot. And I worked for a conglomerate called Litton Industries in their shipbuilding division in cost accounting, which was really a terrible job. I got stuck out in the valley, San Fernando Valley, working in this monster warehouse with no windows, basically counting nails. I mean, yeah, it was a terrible job. I got paid well, so I was driven by that. But ultimately, I just decided permanently I had to go back to the East Coast. I just was not a West Coast guy.
Now, what you failed to tell me now, which I'm bringing out, that during the summer, you really weren't good at jobs during the summer of colleges.
I was trying to avoid that topic. I thought you would forget about it. I was never really inclined to be maintaining jobs. I got a job in Marina Del Rey as a camp counselor, and I was teaching basketball, but I had a habit of actually going and shooting and practicing while the kids were not being watched properly. And ultimately, they kicked me out of that job. And then I was also a pizza delivery guy, and I had a convertible. And I had a lot of problems delivering the pizzas to the folks in Beverly Hills. This is before GPS, mind you. But I had incidences where the pizzas would fly out of the car. They'd get there cold, and to spend 25 minutes getting to a house to deliver pizza for $3 and get 50-cent tip, it just wasn't for me. And they fired me from there too. So I was never really great at that.
Okay, so after Lytton, you come back to East because you want to be back here, and you go to work. You go to Columbia Business School, correct?
That year it was kind of like 2 years in business in training programs, and then you go back to business school. So I wound up going to Manny in their commercial lending training program, and it was a great experience. I wound up going into different commercial banking centers around the city, and each one of them had their own clientele, like 350 Empire State Building dealt with the garment industry, and 40 Wall dealt with maritime. And so I learned a lot about these different businesses. But again, I was never long to stay there. The joke among my friends, who I met many at that time, was that I would start filling out business school applications the day I got into the program at Manny.
What year do you graduate Columbia Business School?
So I wound up getting into Columbia, and I graduated Columbia in '82.
So it's 1982, and is this the time that you meet one of your friends whose father was the chairman of Arthur Andersen?
That's correct. I was looking for some guidance at that point. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Remember, I grew up in a family-run business. I wasn't a Wall Street guy. I didn't have those kind of inclinations, and I didn't know really the world. And I wound up meeting this fellow, Mr. LeBlanc, and he said, "Why don't you come work for the firm and go into tax accounting, because you get to see a lot of different businesses." And that's what I did. So I went through their training program, worked in tax accounting for about 1.5 years, and I hated it. I just didn't like being in a big firm. I didn't like tax in particular. And I got a call from a headhunter for an opportunity on Wall Street. And I wound up taking that position, and it was at E.F. Hutton. Now, during that era, as you may recall, this was the early 80s, Hutton was a prolific raiser of capital for limited partnership financings called syndications. And because I had a tax background, and during that era, some of the tax deals were tax motivated transactions because of the way the tax code was written, they liked my background. So I wound up going to Hutton in the origination department. So we originated product which our retail system sold out. So we'd buy an office building, chop it to 10,000 pieces, and sell it, a piece for $2,500 to a guy in Kansas City. And it was really absolutely fantastic opportunity and experience for me.
So you had a number of years at Hutton. You met a number of people. You even met David Greenfeld. You met Bernie Mendick, some real estate legends over there. And then what happens? You say, hey, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to go out and do it myself.
Well, I was watching these guys. You mentioned Bernie Mendick and others. I mean, Melvin Simon. We really had the who's who coming through Hutton because we were raising so much money. And I was watching these guys, said, you know, I think I can do what these guys are doing. And so I started just getting an inclination as I got more exposure to real estate through my position at Hutton to go look at stuff on the weekends. And one day I found a piece of property on Sunrise Highway in town of Islip that I really loved, and made the decision to go to contract on it, even though I had a full-time job. And I found myself spending more time on that than I did my work. And I went into my boss, who was a friend of mine, and I basically made the decision to scoot out and try it myself. My dad was also pushing me out the door too. At 28 years old, he said, you know, you wait a few more years and you keep making money, you get married, you're going to lose your desire or, you know, take risk. So I went out and started my own business around 29 years old with roughly 2 years worth of money in my pocket to live in case I needed to. But I felt I always could go back and get a job. And I wasn't married. And so my first opportunity was a shopping center site on the Sunrise Highway, as I mentioned before, in the town of Islip. And what I loved about this particular property was that it was at the intersection of Vets Highway and Sunrise. This is a very major retail corridor during that time. It still is today. And this particular property, all the properties to the west of it, so everything going back towards New York, was being rezoned to residential. This was the last commercial piece of property in that area. And the fellow who owned it lived in Florida, and he wasn't aware of this rezoning. So there was an opportunity for us to buy something that we thought would go up in value. And interesting little side note here is I knew nothing. You think you know things, you know, because I was giving money to guys like Bernie Mendick, but until you're the recipient and you have to put it to work, you really don't know the difference between an architect and an engineer or what guys do. And when you have to know it, that's when you learn it. So I learned pretty quickly that we had an issue with this property, that a teeny little piece in the back was zoned residential. And this was a very political town. And I wound up going to an architect named Mike Spector, who was a big architect on the island at that time. And he had just built and designed the courthouse in the town. And they loved him there. And I went to Mike, who was, Reckler was using him, all these guys were using him. I was a nobody. And I said I needed his help on a small 60,000 square foot shopping center site. And I said, in lieu of fees, because I don't have any money, I'll give you a piece of the deal. And he, to his credit, took a chance with us. And because he was involved, we were able to get approved. And he wound up making more money in his role as in that capacity than he would have made on a fee basis. And that launched my career. We wound up, before we were closing, because the deal was subject to approvals, a developer came along and we wound up flipping the deal to the developer, made a bunch of money, which really set me up then to really launch my business.
How'd you end up in New Jersey?
So we started looking for land on Long Island more earnestly at that time. I had a partner with me, and pricing was just too high. And so we started scouring out into New Jersey, and really this is purely propitious. We wound up finding a piece of land at an area called Montville, New Jersey, out where 287 and 80 intersect. Great schools, large project, way over our head. And we were fortunate enough to get a seller who actually was willing to give us a chance. And we were able to tie the property up for 90 days. With the deposit from the money we made on our flip of the site on Long Island. And we wound up running around. The first thing we needed to do was to find a builder partner, because without a builder, we weren't going to get anywhere because we had no track record or net worth. And we happened to find a fellow who was a dear friend of mine who recently passed away, a fellow named Howard Blitman. And Howard said, if you find the money, I'm in. I love the site. And we wound up taking Howard's resume, putting it into our book, and then we could run around and say we built 10,000 houses, which we did. You know, we made the big we here. And fortunately, we wound up going to Arthur Cohen, who you know, during that era was a prolific capital provider. He owned a savings bank called Corey Savings Bank. And Arthur basically gave us the money to start this project, which is a 317-unit townhouse development in Montville, New Jersey, which was an enormous job starting out for us. We were in residential before. And the interesting thing here was, as I mentioned, or may have mentioned, Howard was a builder, but not a developer. Very strong builder, but he didn't really know the first thing about merchandising, marketing, design. And so there was only really the two of us. And so we wound up, he took the construction side, I took the marketing side. And that's how I really started becoming a developer.
Let's talk about the other areas that you got into, because you were in the storage business, you were in the art storage, and now the majority of your involvement is industrial. But I'd like to go over the different asset classes. How you got it.
So what happened was we became a very large for-sale housing developer in the tri-state area, fully integrated firm. And I every morning I'd wake up, drive through the sites, yell at the subs, worry about payroll, pick options with homeowners. And ultimately what happens is the firm started growing, and the availability of land even then was hard. Once you start getting to a certain size, in Westchester, they hate you. They don't want you to build there. And so we came to a fork in the road which says either we're going to move to Arizona, our business, Arizona, or markets where they're more friendly and you can find land, or you're going to go to something else. And we decided to move into income producing properties at that point in time. And I had to remember it's self-storage because when I was working on Wall Street, we worked with a firm called Public Storage, which was really, really in the early days of their evolution. And I just loved the business model, where I couldn't believe people would pay just to store stuff in these lockers. I mean, I walked through those facilities when I was doing due diligence when I was at Hutton, and you'd have a lady at the front playing cards and complete quiet in the building, and yet every month it generated cash. So we wound up shifting gears and going to the self-storage business. And again, by chance, we got presented with an opportunity to buy a portfolio in the Hamptons. And when we were in contract, we wound up finding other sellers out there. And we amassed a portfolio that would represent about 80% of the market. And we went in and consolidated all those, and we wound up flipping it out to a REIT called Sovereign at that time. It's Life Storage today. And that launched our storage business. It wasn't really planned that way. We wound up buying from GE, which had a big subsidiary at that time called Storage USA, about 60 or 7,000 units around New York City. And so did the same thing again, and we wound up selling that to Northwestern Mutual and a sponsor. Really what that did at that time started just kind of opening my eyes to other opportunities in the world. And really that's where I started developing this inclination to try to look, where is the next thing? And that's been the mantra of our business, is trying to be a little bit ahead of the trends. And it really was really ironic because we're now somewhere, let's say around 2005, 2006. And I started observing what was going on with credit, where hairdressers, and I don't mean to demean the hairdresser business, but was coming out of closings with 102% financing, and they had no ability to pay for their condos that they just bought. And when you started seeing that going on, I knew something was going to happen. I obviously could never predict 2008. And I was fortunate enough to hook up with a friend of mine who worked with me at Hutton, who was in the money management business, and we formed a 50-50 venture, and we raised a bunch of money overseas for an opportunity fund. So we closed that fund in the June of 2008. And you'll recall that in the fall of 2008, the world fell apart. So we had a commitment of $250 million from some pension funds in Europe. We had our first closing at 50. And that's really the money we had, because after that, the guys all kind of hid. But going into the downturn, we had $50 million of dry powder, which allowed us to buy buildings in New York and then a large portfolio from Blackstone. But with reference to the buildings in New York, which you were talking about before, we wound up buying a art storage building on the east side, 61st Street, that was in the family for 40 years. It's a very weird business, art storage. You would never know from the street that there were $100 million paintings being stored in that building. And 50% of the revenues are services. And what was really interesting for us is that there was only one competitor in that market, which was on the other side of town on West 55th Street. And it was a family member that they had fractured many years before. And we wound up successfully going across and tying them up. And
okay, with 3 minutes left, let's talk a little bit about the current industrial business, but we have to talk about your wife and your kids.
Okay. In the spirit of kind of trying to predict where the future goes, okay, we wound up buying apartments in 2012 and 13 ahead of the curve in the Southeast, which we wound up selling. And then we moved into industrial. And we moved into industrial because we saw this wave of e-commerce coming. Even in 2017, 18, we knew this was really a once in a lifetime change that was occurring. And so we put all our efforts into industrial. And since 2018, late 2000, let's say 2018, we've developed and acquired about 400 million of industrial. And we are well entrenched into that business and we're very excited about the possibilities ahead, with a particular focus on last mile facilities. Regarding my wife, I met her in the Hamptons. It was a weekend where neither of us had a house because there was shares in those days, as you recall. And it wasn't either of our weekends, but I went out there and I was late getting out, and a friend of mine had a little note on the door, meet us at the Lobster Inn, which was a famous place out there. And I ran to the Lobster Inn, it was packed, and I looked for my friends, and across the room I saw this woman who I thought was beautiful. And I wound up going up to her. She had no interest in me, but I pursued her. And that's how I met my wife.
Let's talk about the children.
I have 3 children. I have a daughter who's finishing law school. Her name's Eliza. I have a middle son who is also, he's in school. I have 3 kids in school. He's pursuing a master's in marketing. His name's Nathaniel. And then I have my young child is at Wharton undergrad. He's graduating in the spring. He's looking for a job, in case anyone out there is, looking for someone. And he has a distinction. At 14 years old, he won our club championship as a golfer. So he's a golf star.
And fortunately, your dad is still living in California at 93. We have some great pictures of him.
Yes, he is.
You missed the toy business, but you exceeded in many other businesses, and I'm very happy that you were my guest today, and thanks again for being here.
Michael, thank you so much. I've always admired your shows, and I'm honored to be speaking today.